All right, everyone, have you heard of the Protecting the Right to Organize Act? By the way, several people sending this in as a news tip, so thank you for that. Link in the description, archived, of course. The Democrats have wasted no time especially the left-wing Democrats, in crafting draconian and dystopian legislation. Now that they sense victory, which is a farce because they're really overstretching already. Push polling aside, with Biden approval, Rasmussen says he's at 50%. Bullshit. Push polls aside, they're really overstretching their mandate at the moment. I don't see good things for them in the midterms. By the way, I'll be analyzing as well, either today or tomorrow, the DeSantis-Cuomo nexus, actually. That's sort of a forewarning of, I think, what's going to happen politically. It's not looking good, especially for the neolibs. Maybe even more, oddly enough, for the leftists. It'd be funny. They eke away more power from the actual Democratic Party, but still don't have a mandate, and it just totally locks them down in complete dysfunction. You see several of them rambling every single day on Twitter about the filibuster. Elizabeth Warren is trying to cast herself off as progressive again, which has got to be the funniest thing that I've ever seen. Because she has to compete with like Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar and people like that, and it doesn't really work. But anyway, the Democrats, through this particular act, want to eliminate the right to work. Among other things, there's two components. The first component, which is bad, would be bad for people who do, specifically, they're working in companies, but they choose not to be part of a union. In many states, you have the right to work, and even if the company has a union, you can't be forced to join it. You can't be forced to join union dues. The way it was before, and I believe this is a federal court decision in several states. In some cases, like if you joined up with a steelworking plant or something and there was a steelworkers union, because they were technically still speaking for you as a steelworker, they could force you to pay union dues even if you weren't actually a member of the union. You don't like unions, you don't like that union, you don't like who leads the union, you've decided not to be part of it, but you're still paying union dues. This was done away with. This seeks to reverse that. The idea is to unions have been dying for years because people have finally realized that the people that head the unions, they're not in the same socioeconomic rung as the people they represent. They're able to be bribed, they're able to be blackmailed. Unions do not work. They do nothing. And anyway, what happens is the corporation ends up backing off and the union becomes the abusers. So that's number one. If you belong to a union, the Biden administration has abandoned you. So for the millions of you out there who are unionized, you voted for the Democrats, sorry about that. Maybe you'll think twice in the midterms. The second part, which is far worse in my opinion, targets the self-employed. It targets freelancers who are doing the same kind of work within the same industries, but they're not a member even necessarily of like a corporation. They're lending themselves out freelance. It is not entirely clear whether the attack on freelancing would even extend to the internet realm. And that's why it's so concerning. Because there are literally millions of people in the United States alone who, at least as a side hustle, make some money on the internet. They sell things, merchandise on a site. They do graphic design. They do what I'm doing, content creation. They publish books, Amazon or Lulu or whatever. They do an OnlyFans. They do camgirl stuff. Literally millions of people would be potentially impacted by this legislation if it is interpreted in the broader sense. The problem is, what do we know about legislation, especially when it's coming from the Democratic Party? They don't read it. It's overly broad. It's not properly structured. It's infinitely reinterpreted, and it ends up becoming a problem, and you have to go back and revise it over and over and over again. I think this is a huge blunder, though, by the left in the Democratic Party, and again, the Senate is not likely to pass this. So there's a silver lining, is that it's probably not going to actually be passed. The Democrat partisans in the House of Representatives held court and they held the line. Senate's a little bit different. Remember, Joe Manchin exists. That's all you need to say. It'd be interesting if I had to praise a Democrat for saving literally millions and millions of people from having to either be forced to pay union dues despite not being part of the fucking union so that they could just go work and do what they wanted to do, or they didn't want to join the Teamsters, they didn't want to have that problem, or they're a freelancer. They're competing with mainline corporations by doing their own thing. And keep in mind the context as well economically. Right now, there are several million Americans that have been made unemployed by recession conditions and lockdowns. A lot of those people are freelancing. A lot of those people said, look, I don't have a job. I don't have anything else to do. I'm gonna try. At the very least, I'm gonna develop some sort of side hustle so that I can make enough so that, I'm not eating ramen soup every single night. I do still have rent to pay. The Democrats and Republicans both agree that I should be fucked in the ass. I'm not gonna let them fuck me in the ass without a fight until they started sewing masks. Like they're living in Thailand or something. They started sewing masks, or distributing food, or lending themselves out for some sort of unskilled labor. It's like they're doing freelance work. But unfortunately, they're going to revise the way in which freelance work is categorized and screw these people, both with taxes and with regulations. What the fuck are they supposed to do? To those millions of Americans that are already hurting, the Democrats want you to suffer more. Some of you have alleviated that suffering, at least to some extent. In fact, some of these people probably are doing pretty well. They innovated because they were forced to innovate, and now all of a sudden they find themselves, they're like, hey, I was flipping burgers. Now I've got a small business. I do food shipments in the region. I'm thinking about hiring a couple of workers. Maybe I'll incorporate. I'll buy a van. Wow, I'm a business owner. I'm in the middle class now. I'm no longer in the lower echelon. The reason why the Democrats are trying to pass this bullshit is specifically to prevent that upward mobility. They don't want an entire generation of people who innovated. They don't want the next Bill Gates. They want the current Bill Gates because he already donates to them. They don't want any political outsiders having upward mobility. They want your upward mobility, if it exists at all, to be requisite on you taking out a bunch of debt in a college that funds these morons, number one, and then working for a corporation that'll cut you loose if you're politically incorrect, number two. And then if you toe the line, if you're a good little lemming, a good little Timmy, then you're able to rise up maybe a step on the socioeconomic ladder. You were middle class, now you're in the margins of the upper middle class. Okay, your gilded cage is a little bit bigger. It's got an extra room or two. You were poor, now you're working class. You're allowed to work. You're allowed to work until you die in your boots. That's what they want. The Democrats have never stood for upward mobility. They're waging war on middle and working class individuals for the crime of wanting to get ahead. Oh, how dare you? You're doing skilled labor and you're not paying a union a huge chunk of your salary to represent you. Well, it doesn't matter if the fucking union manages to negotiate better wages for you. The Democrats are just going to tax those wages and you'll pay it more union dues, more kickbacks. For some fucking millionaire smoking cigars, probably palling around with the business owners behind the scenes anyway. Unions are a failure. Freelancing works. Self-employment is great. Censorship is evil. All of these sweeping statements. Generally, these sweeping statements tend to be kind of hyperbolic, but I don't know. I think that they're pretty true. At least in my anecdotal experience, look at me. I rose up from the lowest end of society, like the untouchables class economically, practically, as far as the U.S. goes, to being what I am now. That was in, there's no union. The Germans tried to unionize YouTube. That was a farce, by the way, 'cause it's not a German firm. I don't need representation by anyone but myself, and the government, by and large, being out of the way of the internet's the only reason that success existed. Now the government's trying to come in and tax every transaction, and regulate every speech, and in this case, screw literally millions of people who don't want to belong to a union because they recognize that unions are bullshit. That's about all. Peace out.